Viltrox is sponsoring today's video for me to showcase their brand new lens to you. The Viltrox 135mm f1.8 Lab. Priced at $899, my first thought is that this lens seems like a really interesting budget alternative to the Sony 135mm f1.8G Master. Ever since they released their Viltrox 16mm f1.8, I've been keeping an eye on what new exciting lenses they have lined up, and this one really hit the mark on producing stunning images. While today's video is sponsored by Viltrox, you guys know that I'm always trying to share my honest opinions on these products with you, and hopefully these sample photos, videos, and charts will really share the full story of what this lens is capable of. Alright, let's jump right in. Right away, we're going to talk about the fun stuff, image quality, and of course we're going to talk about sharpness and how well this lens does. And it was a pretty easy one. Corner to corner, this lens delivers some sharp results, even wide open at f1.8. As a matter of fact, as you stop down, there is some incremental increase in sharpness, but nothing major. And as I'll get into later, this lens makes an incredible portrait lens, since I know a lot of us portrait photographers love to shoot wide open for that shallow depth of field, and in this case, you don't have to compromise corner to corner sharpness to achieve that. Naturally, if we're talking about portraits and subject separation, the next thing I want to know is how good does the bokeh look? Without disappointing, the bokeh rendition on this lens is very smooth, even when compared against the Sony 135mm f1.8G Master. We're talking about creamy bokeh that helps your subject stand out against the background, and if we take a moment to look at the bokeh balls themselves, we'll find that the lens produces clean bokeh with soft edges. Overall, I'm a big fan of the bokeh rendition. Lens flares also look pretty clean. You definitely have some bloom and ghosting, but nothing excessive as I've seen on some lenses, and about as suppressed as the results I got on the Sony 135mm f1.8G Master when I tested it a few years ago. Chromatic aberration is one of those things I like to test on third-party lenses because often these brands are focused on sharpness and bokeh, and we end up always seeing excessive, unwanted chromatic aberration, but in this case, it's actually quite minimal, and only really present when wide open at f1.8. Once you stop down to f2.8, it becomes nearly non-existent, and at f4, it's basically completely gone. Distortion on this lens is also really well controlled. As you can see in this test chart photo, the lines remain pretty straight throughout the entire image with no obvious barrel or pincushion distortion present. On top of that, for photography, this will be even less noticeable once correction profiles are available for this lens in programs like Lightroom. Another thing I keep an eye out for is vignetting, and at f1.8, there's a very mild amount of light loss in the corners, but as you can see, once you stop down to f2.8, that basically disappears and stays that way as you continue to stop down. Overall, I think image quality is what really helps this lens stand out, and at $899, we're really pushing the limit of what we can call a budget lens. But if we're only judging it from an image rendering perspective, this lens knocks it out of the park. Now, let's talk about autofocus. This lens is a big lens, and it has a lot of glass to move, and this is also usually where third-party options start falling behind first-party lens options. And the results were interesting, and I'm not entirely sure why it's the case. So if you guys have an idea or a theory of why this is happening, let me know in the comment section down below. So in video autofocus tracking, the lens performs quite well, able to keep up with a slow-moving subject like me walking towards the camera, and even fast-moving subjects like when I ran towards the camera recording at 120 frames per second. And those results looked pretty good. That is until I switch over to photo mode. Here we see a completely different story. In a single test where I was walking towards the camera, I counted all of the photos that are perfectly focused, acceptably focused, aka it missed ever so slightly, and out of focus. And of that first set, I got a 43% perfect hit rate and a 70% acceptable hit rate. This number goes down once I started running towards the camera. I did this test 3 times, and with all of the numbers combined, we're looking at a performance of 36% perfect hit rate and a 53% acceptable hit rate. What it felt like was happening was like every other photo would be either perfectly in focus or almost perfectly in focus, whereas the other photos in between were out of focus. So I'm not entirely sure why this is happening, and I'm not sure if this is something that Viltrox can fix in a later firmware update, but this is definitely something to keep in mind. This lens in its current state is not something I would recommend for something that's fast-paced like sports photography or wildlife photography, but I still think it's absolutely perfect for things like portraiture or narrative work. And we'll talk about this more in the conclusion of this video, but if this lens was able to get closer to like 75% perfect hit rate when it came to autofocus, I think that this lens would absolutely give Sony a run for their money. But as it stands, this is definitely a setback that kind of makes it a harder recommendation depending on what you're going to be shooting with this lens. Now, let's take a quick look at close focus and focus breathing. For close focus, the minimum focusing distance of this lens is 0.72 meters or about 28.3 inches, which is plenty for most photography use cases outside of macro photography. Focus breathing is also pretty noticeable, so it wouldn't be ideal for things like visual effects work, but otherwise I personally find this to be less of an issue for the type of images I shoot. Specs are specs, but test charts can really only tell us a partial story of the lens's capability, so to really put this lens to use, my friend Ryan and I got together to shoot a little sequence using just this lens to show you guys what this lens is capable of. Alright, next let's take a look at the build quality. This is a hefty, substantial feeling lens. It's definitely one of the more premium third-party lenses I've held in a while, and you can definitely tell that Viltrox is going for a G-Master vibe with its design, all the way down to the Lab Series badge on the lens, indicating it's their flagship lineup. The lens features a focus ring with an autofocus manual focus switch, an aperture ring with a click-declick switch, a focus limit switch, and 2 programmable function buttons. On top of that, we see the return of the small screen that we saw in the 16mm f1.8 lens from Viltrox, which shows some lens information like focus distance. It can also be further customized using their app to upload an image, though I imagine not many of us are that excited for it, but it's a fun little gimmick. On the mount of the lens, there's a rubber gasket to help with weather sealing in wet environments. On the front of the lens, you'll find the massive glass element and a standard 82mm front filter thread, which if you're going to buy a lens that you might even remotely consider expensive, I would highly recommend picking up a UV filter. You can pick up any brand of UV filters, but Viltrox also sent me one of their 82mm filters, and I've just been using that one, and I haven't seen any noticeable effects on the images produced. But I do get the peace of mind knowing that I'm not going to accidentally scratch my front lens element, especially one as large as this. The autofocus motors are also very quiet. Not silent, but also not loud enough to cause any problems with your video production. Overall, solid build quality all around. Like I said before, this lens is priced at $899, which doesn't sound that affordable until you consider that the 4-year-old Sony G-Master is priced at almost $2,100, and the Samyang Rokinon 135mm f1.8s are priced at around $800 with less features compared to the Viltrox lens. I think this lens, first and foremost, produces some really gorgeous looking images. Everything from super sharp resolution to creamy bokeh rendition to pleasant looking lens flares. It falls short when it comes to autofocus performance, but otherwise is an outstanding lens, especially at its price point. If you're somebody that shoots a lot of portrait photos, I think this is a must consider lens. And if you shoot a lot of video that's not sports or wildlife, I also think it's a pretty good lens to consider. And if you don't use continuous autofocus that often, or you just outright use manual focus when you're shooting photos or videos, I think that this lens actually honestly competes with the Sony 135 f1.8 G-Master at a fraction of the cost, and that's really its strongest suit, is the image that it can deliver. If you're interested in checking out this lens, I'll have links in the description down below. I also have a discount code that'll get you 8% off if you buy it through the Viltrox website. You don't have to use that, but if you want 8% off, that option's also available. Alright, that's it for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a like while you're at it. Let me know in the comment section down below on what you think of the Viltrox 135mm f1.8 Lab, and as always, I will see you in the next one. Peace.